I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. In this world, there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate. We think too much and feel too little. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness. Without these qualities, life will be violent. And all will be lost. All will be lost. Do not despair. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die. Dictators die. And the power they took from the people will return to the people. Will return to the people. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world to do away with greed. Now let us fight to free the world, to fulfill that promise. Let us all unite.
Welcome to the Corporation Nation Radio Show. Yet again, my name is Clint Richardson. I'm your host. Today is Wednesday, January 8th, 2014. And again, I want to wish you a Happy New Year. Now, just to let you know, the government just sent me, President Obama, in fact, just sent me personally a gift for you. And he requested that I read that for you. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. He says, first of all, that he hopes that you have a very, very, very happy New Year. Yeah. And that the gift that keeps on giving is the gift that he wanted to give you, like so many of his predecessors. Of course, my computer just went down, so give me 1 second. All right. So here is his message to the people here. He says, Happy New Year, America. And, of course, he means happy 2014. He says, here's your gift. Congratulations. He says, in honor of the American way, I am raising your income tax from 35% to 39.6%. I'm raising your income payroll tax from 37.4% to 52.2%. Capital gains taxes will go from 15% to 28%. Dividends tax will go from 15% to 39.6%. And, you know, because 2014, there's something about that number that just really hit a nerve. And so Obama was very generous. Of course, you know, this was really your entire representative government that really came up with this very special gift, it's like an extra candle on your birthday or on your Happy New Year cake. And so here it is. Not only is it a wonderfully large tax, it's the biggest tax in history. Your estate inheritance tax, sometimes called the orphan tax, goes from 0% to 55% on anything you get from the estate of your parents. Of course, those things in that estate have been taxed over and over and over for years, so really it's 100% tax, but they don't like to tell you that. You know, it's all for the good of the continuity of the United States, of course. So he says the states are free to do, of course, what they want to give you the gift of taxation. But just you know, he wanted you to know that he loves you and that the taxes were necessary to keep protecting you and keep you safe, to keep the tradition of exaction, which of course means monies that aren't due. Stealing or extortion is another way to put it, as defined in Bouvier's dictionary. So he wanted you to know that extortion is alive and well, and that these involuntary taxes that, of course, are not voted on by you, only by your attorneys called representatives, that this is the new order of things. And he says, of course, expect great new things in the coming years, including more socialism. And in the spirit of Larkin, Texas, he says, Lark, my friend, communitarianism is on your doorstep. Welcome, folks, to 2014. So happy New Year. I hope that you, those of you who actually are stupid enough to claim income, enjoy those taxes, especially those income taxes. And, well, hey, what can I say? Keep participating in the system that enslaves you and enjoy your gift from your rulers. Well, I wanted to continue where we left off yesterday, because I want to make sure that people really get this concept. Because there's very few things in my life personally that have really changed my outlook and whole perception of life and of nature and of the self-awakening that I've gone through. One of those things is this concept of what a right is, whether it's a positive or a negative right. Now, we discussed yesterday, but I want to make sure that we understand that if we have a negative right, we're talking about a God-given inherent right. And that is simply the right to not have anything forced against you. Those are your inherent rights. Those are what we call God-given, because no man can come between you and God, or nature, whatever your preference is. The problem is that government is in the positive realm. It creates positive law. And the definition of positive law, as we discussed yesterday using the analogy of magnets, where you try to push a positive and a negative magnet together, what do? But they repulse each other. The problem, unfortunately, is that with contract law, according to the maxims of law, a contract or treaty will certainly take the place of an inherent right. It is a voluntary relinquishment of those rights. It is a temporary giving up of one's relationship with God, if you will. So, again, very simply, although it takes a while to really grasp this, government, when it offers you rights, when it states that there is a Bill of Rights, even though there is no such thing, that they're actually called articles, just like the articles of the Lieber Code tell you what rights you have under martial law. The articles in the quote-unquote Bill of Rights tell you the rights that you have and how they can be taken away. Your life, liberty, your property can be taken away, for instance, with due process of law. It's not declaring that you have a right. It's declaring which rights can be taken away, which, of course, makes them revocable privileges. We can also look at such things as the privilege. Yes, that's right, the privilege of habeas corpus, as listed in the Constitution, which, of course, says that the privilege of habeas corpus shall not be taken away. But, of course, a privilege, unless in times of emergency or war or treason and that kind of thing. Of course, I'm just winging it here. But the point is that it's not listed as a right. You see, habeas corpus never has been a right. It's always been a privilege. We misquote it. We say the Constitution guarantees the right of habeas corpus. But turns out, actually, no, it just offers the privilege and then offers in its small print how to take that privilege away. And again, it all relies on due process and the state of emergency, which we've been in since technically the Civil War, but more realistically since 1933 with the Emergency Banking Act and all of that. A 55% tax on everything you get from an estate. That's just horrible. Now, imagine this for a second. I was talking. Oh, we got a break. I was talking to Mr. Walter Burian about this, and it's not often that he goes into conspiracy theories. But he said, can you imagine a 55% tax on everything if people die? We'll be back, folks. Run that through your head.
neighbor. Welcome again to this neighborhood. I'd like to show you something. You know what this is? Well, maybe if I press this button. There are so many things to learn about in this world. And so many people who can help us learn. And so many people who can help us learn. Did you ever grow anything in the garden of your mind? In the garden of your mind. You can grow ideas in the garden of your mind.
So I want you to imagine now that you're the leader of the so-called free world. Of course, that's a misnomer, if ever there was one, as we nation build across the world and demand democracy so that the majority can be manufactured and create the law. So imagine, again, it's you're the leader of this supposed free world, and you have just created a 55% tax on the estate. Now, some people will call this an orphan tax, meaning that both parents now have died, the estate sits in probate, and the court is doling out the property, which, again, of course, should be very clear that there is no such thing as a property when it comes to real estate, that there is no inheritance per se, if that inheritance can be taxed. It's kind of another misnomer that we have the right of inheritance. In fact, we don't. We have the privilege of obtaining the property that is left over in our parents' estate. And, of course, we should always recommend to people that people do a will, of course, and put that into a trust so that these taxes do not apply. That's something you'd have to contact an attorney. One of the few good uses of an attorney, I think. And so imagine, again, now I've got, say, half of America where, you know, the parents own the estate and the children have been pretty much diminished into a status of poverty and really not knowing what the heck's going on, waiting for that estate. So what happens? Well, let's just play the puzzle here. A 55% tax on the orphan estate. All right. Well, okay. So now my parents, now this is not my particular situation, but let's just say my parents or your parents have a beautiful horse ranch right in the middle of Nebraska worth $2 million, 40 acres, wonderful, wonderful, beautiful piece of land. With, of course, a lot of assets, beautiful thoroughbred horses and the like. Beautiful, house. 55% of the value of that as a tax is going to be required by government just because your parents died. Huh. Well, gee, how are you going to pay that? That's going to be, what is that going to be, a little over $1 million that you're going to owe to government just so you can take over your $2 million estate. Well, that means you're probably going to have to sell. And, of course, one of government's investment-held corporations is going to have the money to buy that from you. Let's see. So what's that going to mean? Well, that means you're going to have to sell. Unfortunately, that means you're probably going to have to pay... Oh, I don't know. What did we say the taxes were for capital gains? Oh, yes, capital gains are going to 28%, or possibly 39%. So that means that when you sell the estate for $2 million, if you can get the value of it, of course, in today's crazy market, you're going to have to pay anywhere from 15 to 39% estate tax. Wow. Boy, that brings us to about 95%. So now we've sold the estate to pay for the estate tax, and we're only left with just enough to pay the estate tax. Therefore, the children end up with nothing because, of course, they have to pay capital gains taxes or some other forms of taxes through the fact that they're selling the property. And that is the gift that keeps on giving. How are children in future ages, in future generations, possibly going to be able to hold on to their estate, hold on to what their parents worked so hard for, with a 55% tax, which, of course, will require them to sell the estate in order to pay the tax. And then, of course, again, pay the taxes on selling the estate. I mean, what a ridiculous notion. So Walter one day comes up to me, and Walter's a very serious, no-nonsense kind of guy, and he says, think about the conflict of interest that presents to a psychopath in government like all presidents and all of our representatives, and I think I can safely say that now, since none of them are standing up for us, or at least some of them are pretending to, but now imagine the conflict of interest when, that means that if I kill, let's see, there's 300 and something million people in America, and I could kill, let's say, just say 100,000 people, which would leave approximately, I don't know, 250,000 maybe different estates that would each have a 55% tax on them. The kids would have to sell those estates. Most of them, maybe 150, would have to sell. So in the end, government would stand to make an incredibly huge amount of money simply by killing a bunch of people with their estates. Now, for that to come from a guy like Walter, to me, is kind of scary because, again, Walter's a no-nonsense guy. And if you actually think about it, this really does create a conflict of interest. When you stand to gain 55% of the value of an estate, well then, gosh, it's probably in your best interest to do everything you can to get your hands on that estate. To even go so far as to murder or possibly create a situation or a legal status, put them in jail, for instance, and tell them the estate is no longer theirs. I mean, it's just the possibilities are endless, I guess, is what we're saying here. And of course, we have a massive push to get rid of property rights. Property rights are, that's the old age. We're in the new age, folks. Property rights are not consistent with communitarianism. Property rights are not consistent with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Property is a bad thing because it takes away from the rest of the world. That's right. Figure that one out. All right, so to get back to our conversation yesterday, we're going down a list of explaining what is negative and what is positive. Again, these words they have the opposite meaning of what they sound, so we get confused when we say, well, isn't a positive right a good thing? Well, no, actually. Unfortunately, a positive right is not a good thing. Unless, of course, you're a criminal. Then a positive right allows such things as the banking rules. So banks have certain rights as persons, as artificial persons. Corporations have rights, as persons. Corporations are people too. So in that case, yeah, if you're part of the criminal syndicate and willing to make a profit at other people's expense, then a positive right is actually a good thing. But for the vast majority of people, a positive right is actually the taking away of a negative right or a God-given right and replacing it with something else. It is the polar opposite of a God-given inherent right. So we went down the list. What are negative things? Negative things are man. Okay, a living, breathing man. The word free is a negative term, as opposed to freedom, which is to obey the law. We'll be back, folks.
Wake up, wake up, wake up and look around you. We're lost in space and the earth is your home.
Derivatives, quantitative easing, trade imbalances, recession, low GDP, nations close to collapsing, and subprime loans, foreclosed homes, and people's taxes spent to bail out too big to fail AAA banks again. Fear levels rising as the US crash seems imminent, having smashed the debt ceiling of 14 trillion. Despite protests and clashes in Athens streets, the IMF imposed structurally unjust programs in Greece, where in fact the term economy entered our language from the Greek oikonomia, meaning household management. Well, how are we managing? Theories abound, but in practice, does anyone actually know what the hell's even happening? Well, seems we've come to our global auditing, our financial day of reckoning. It's an interesting quandary. Have we invested too much in this enterprise to admit the solution might lie in its very demise? For our real economy is something much broader. It's GDP measured not by our ability to hoard, but our capacity to relearn and earn our place in nature's order, and thus remain on this planet Ark, our Pandora.
All right, folks, welcome back. We're talking about negative versus positive. Remember, negative is always good. Positive is always bad, unless you're into criminal activity. Unless you're into having rights over others that you don't deserve, that kind of thing, then positive rights are for you. But for the rest of us out here who just wish to be free and live in equity, not equality, but equity, which is basically before it gets raped by the word, that is, before the word equity gets raped by Agenda 21 and sustainability and social justice and social equity and all of that crap. The word equity simply means in harmony with natural law. It means that no one is equal. It means that, well, we'll get into that because, equality is such an important aspect of controlling the people. The word free is negative. The word freedom is positive. One is simply the act of being free under God. One is the act of obeying the law and being free to do as one pleases as long as the law of man is obeyed. Dom, D-O-M, being dominion over this state of being free by government. A free man is under the negative law, while a citizen is a positive law construct. Of course, an artificial person. Natural is negative, political is positive. Liberty is negative, although the lawyers came along and changed the word liberty and created natural liberty and positive liberty, individual liberty, and many other forms of liberty. So you have to be careful with that word. But technically, if you have a positive liberty, then you have a privilege or entitlement. You see, these are not natural things. In other words, you're not born with an entitlement. That can only be accomplished by status. Status is positive or artificial. God-given is negative, while man-made or government-granted is positive. That's a pretty simple one because that just means nature is negative, while everything man-made is positive. It's pretty simple when you look at it that way. A right is natural, although a right can also be political. What's the best way to explain the difference between a natural right and a political right? It's actually kind of a difficult one, but the easiest way that I can think of it is to take the Federal Reserve. See, we all have this kind of illusionary image of what the Federal Reserve is, but let's just explain real quick. What can the Federal Reserve? What is the Federal Reserve? It is called, as so many other offices are called, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency of government. Now, when we use the word of, very, very important word because it means belonging to. When we say that the Federal Reserve, as well as the Post Office, the Securities Exchange Commission, Social Security Administration, all these different administrations, all the boards, when we say that they are of the United States, in other words, independent agencies of the United States, you can just type that into Wikipedia, by the way, and you can see the dozens and dozens of different independent agencies of government. Independence is the word I was thinking. Independence is either natural or political. Now, if you have a natural independence, we're talking about the negative. If you have a political independence, well, then you are under positive law. So when we say that the Federal Reserve is independent of government, we simply mean that it is allowed to do certain things by government, but it is not above the law. It is a government agency. To be quite clear, it is an independent agency of government. So let's take another example. Basically, what that means is the Federal Reserve can make rules. All right? Can't make law, but it can make rules. It must obey the laws created by Congress. Congress can end the Federal Reserve at any time. Reserve Act is very clear that the Federal Reserve will be usurped into the Treasury, all assets into the Treasury in the Federal Reserve Act. There is no doubt about these facts. Unfortunately, you have several authors out there who jumped the gun before they really did their research, plagiarized a lot of different people who didn't have the internet, and unfortunately created this mass illusion of what the Federal Reserve actually is. There are certainly agencies much more powerful than the Federal Reserve. So let's see. The best way I can describe the difference between positive and negative, or in this case, independence. What is independence? And this includes the United States as well. Big hint. Did we have positive independence or negative independence? Well, we had positive independence when we first started out. The question is, did the Articles of Confederation, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution, did that actually create a positive or a negative independence? Well, it's a good question. Some people would say it created a negative independence, meaning that we were completely detached from the Vatican and the Crown, although most of those people say that only lasted maybe a decade or so. Most people think we won the Revolutionary War, although when you read the treaties, there's no such mention of the United States winning any war. The debts, of course, and engagements. Engagements actually mean contractual obligations. We're certainly never severed, and that's interesting too, because one of my listeners sent me a nice little quote. It's very simple. It says, "Debtor, not a master be." Debtor, not a master be. In other words, if you're in debt to someone, you cannot be the master of your own estate. You owe money. You owe something, whether that be monetary or an engagement. So, let's go back to the Federal Reserve. Now, let's say that you are the Federal Reserve. Inside your house is the Federal Reserve. You are the independent agency of government. Now, inside your home, for your children and your wife or husband, you can make the rules of your house. You can do just about anything you want. You have freedom, political freedom, in your own home. What does that mean? That means you cannot break the law. That means you must follow the law of government. So while the Federal Reserve is in operation, it is under United States law. Period. End of story. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean you can't make your own rules. Okay? And, of course, these independent agencies of government are set up in order to allow a board of directors to govern something that the Congress just doesn't have time to do. Can you imagine if Congress was actually running the post office and running the Social Security Administration and running the banking system and running everything else? What could they possibly do to do any kind of legislature? I mean, they would be full-time running every single aspect. This is why they create independent agencies of government. It's really no great mystery. The whole Federal Reserve thing is actually, to me nowadays, it's just a joke when I hear people talk about it. And of course, they want that system to end. That's the real trick, and they want the people to believe that they're going to end it. End the Fed. End the Fed. The great call of the Ron Paulites and the Libertarian Party, which, again, as we've now discovered was pretty much created by the Heritage Foundation, the Koch brothers, of which Ron Paul was the first president of the Koch brothers organization. So, end the Fed. Well, what the heck is going to happen when you end the Fed, folks? You're gonna rejoice. You're gonna say, "Wow, we finally had a victory." Meanwhile, just like 9/11, there's already a plan to institute world banking. And you've all been fooled into ending the one thing that regulates the banking industry. Now that's gone. World banking comes in, and you're still celebrating drunk off your butts because you ended the Fed. Yeah, right. We'll be back.
We've already stripped you of your liberty, privacy, civil rights, and dignity. You want some more?
Unfortunate reality in the so-called truth movement, the so-called patriot movement, whatever you want to call it nowadays. One of the greatest things that happened to me was understanding what the Federal Reserve was. And I know it gets confusing for people because we're just constantly inundated with a bunch of crap about the Federal Reserve. Now, I've written extensively on it. One of my articles was called, on my blog, which is realityblogger.wordpress.com, was called The Incontrovertible Conundrum of Dr. Ron Paul, which explains a lot about the Federal Reserve and his bills. Of course, his bill to end the Fed came out before his bill to audit the Fed, which, of course, is another thing I've written extensively on. It's very simple to verify that the Federal Reserve, of course, has been audited because it's a requirement in U.S. code, which you can read for yourself. It's a requirement of the Federal Reserve Act. In fact, if you really want to understand what the Federal Reserve is, go read the original Federal Reserve Act and then go read the amended Federal Reserve Act. Of course, Congress amends the Federal Reserve Act on a regular basis. One of the most interesting parts of that was, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's actually a bill that they created, and this is great because it creates the illusion. This is how government works. It wants you to think that Republicans and Democrats are against each other. It wants you to think that the federal government and the Federal Reserve are against each other. Of course it wants to create a division in your mind. And of course, when you just sit and think about just for a minute how ridiculous the concept that the Federal Reserve is separate from the United States government, even though it was created by Congress, and even though it says very clearly that it can be ended by Congress, and even though Ron Paul's bill to end the Fed stated very clearly that all Congress had to do was approve Ron Paul's bill and the Federal Reserve would be ended and all its assets would go back to the Treasury. It's not like Congress can say that about Walmart. It's not like Ron Paul could have created a bill and Walmart. Congress wouldn't be able to vote and take all the proceeds and profits and property of Walmart because it's not federal. I mean, you just have to think about the logic that's been perverted in the end the Fed move. And then, of course, after he wanted to end the Fed, he wanted to spend so much money to audit the Fed. Of course, the comprehensive annual financial report has been the audit of the Federal Reserve for, I believe, 90 something years now. There's been an audited financial statement as required by government. That is the audit of the Federal Reserve. If you want to learn most of what you could possibly learn about the happenings of the Federal Reserve, just go pull up the CAFR. It's right there on the Board of Governors site. Not hard to find at all. It's a public document, just like all your cities and everything else have an audit. It's a requirement of all government agencies. I should say government corporations, municipal corporations, counties, states, and, of course, Federal Reserve, Social Security. You want to know what's going on with Social Security and its fund? Just go pull up the CAFR. It's right there on the Social Security website, not hard to find. You can go pull up the post office. You can go pull up all of these different independent agencies of government, and you can see exactly what's happening. The Federal Reserve is not that secret in what it does. It's all listed in the CAFR. And you will see that all the interest on Federal Reserve notes, that thing that we all use and as a rallying point, the fact that interest is charged on Federal Reserve notes, well, guess what, folks? Right in the annual financial report, it tells you in the audit that all the money that's charged as interest on Federal Reserve notes goes right into the Treasury account. Generally, because the Federal Reserve and the Treasury work hand in hand, the Treasury will often turn that right back into the gold that collateralizes the dollar. Did you know, for instance, that in the Federal Reserve annual financial report, that the Federal Reserve, that the federal government collateralized all of the Federal Reserve dollars with over 238 million troy ounces of gold? Did you know that? Did you know that it lists that as the collateral for the U.S. dollar? Doesn't mean that you can trade your dollars in for gold like you used to be able to. It just means that that is what collateralizes it. Unfortunately, your property and everything else is also collateral for the good faith and credit of the government because you're all chattel. I'm chattel. Whatever you think your status is, you're chattel. I think we covered that yesterday, in fact. So if you want to learn about any agency of government, the point is go to its audited financial statements. For the Federal Reserve, that's about a 500 to 600 page document that you can pull up and start reading now if you want to. Go ahead. Go ahead. It's more important that you understand that the Federal Reserve fallacy, that it's completely naturally independent of government, as opposed to politically independent, which means it has to follow all the rules that Congress does create. And again, the Federal Reserve can make its own rules. What can the Federal Reserve do? It can regulate things as long as it's not breaking the law, which is, of course, a loose statement because government wants the Federal Reserve to come as close to breaking the law as possible. Why do you think they got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act? I mean, why would Congress do that if it wanted to control and rein in this evil banking industry? Guess what, folks? Think about it. Another complete fallacy. Who creates money? It's not the Federal Reserve. It's the banks. Money, according to the Federal Reserve, is created when you go and you sign a document, an application for a loan or a credit card or anything else. That's where the money is created. Congress creates money by appropriations. It creates future money that will be taxed. The Federal Reserve is just an agency to regulate the banking industry. Who is the banker then? Is it J.P. Morgan Chase? Is it Bank of America? No. Who creates money? In reality, government. What good would the Federal Reserve be, and what good would any bank be if they weren't allowed through the Federal Reserve System to create money through reserve banking? The only way they can do that is if government allows them to. Do you think J.P. Morgan Chase? You think government's sitting there going, oh, my gosh, what are we going to do about J.P. Morgan Chase? No, it owns the majority stock through pension fund investments and other investments. Government is the majority stockholder. It controls through corporate governance these corporations, these banks. It is a unified, completely communist, fascist, socialist, communitarianist takeover. And it's been happening since about 1942, I believe, when CAFR first started coming about. when the massive investment scheme and all the pension funds started being created, which was just a mass effort to buy everything and to continue the rebuilding of America through its corporations. Government is the owner of these corporations. So as a parent, you can make rules in your own home, but you can't break the law. Likewise, and that gives you political liberty or political independence, but it doesn't give you natural independence. Because once you break the law, government comes in, cracks your head, takes your kids away. Right? So please understand that the Federal Reserve is not private in the sense that it is private from government. It is nothing more than a franchise of a private government. The whole thing's private, basically. So they're not separate. They're not against each other in any way, shape, or form. In fact, that bill that they created, one of my favorite things is that they actually created a bill to allow the Federal Reserve not to disclose information in congressional sessions. That's why you have the illusion that Ben Bernanke can tell Congress to piss off. It's a lie. It's done by Congress. They created the ability for that to happen so that no disclosure happens within Congress. It's a mutual criminal syndicate. Stay with us. We'll take some calls after the break.
Soldiers, don't give yourselves to brutes. Men who despise you, enslave you, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel. Who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men. Machine men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines. You are men. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful. Let us use that power to make this life a wonderful adventure. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world to do away with greed. A world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Do not despair. The hate of men will pass and dictators die. And the power they took from the people will return to the people. Let us all unite.
Welcome back to the Corporation Nation. You're on Republic Broadcasting Network. We are talking about, I guess we're off on a tangent again, so we'll switch this back. Now, I guess the best way to there's one other article I wrote that I highly recommend. If you just type in to your search engine, today's creatures from Jekyll Island. Today's creatures from Jekyll Island, you will find my second post. The first one was called The Incontrovertible Conundrum of Dr. Ron Paul. Those two articles go over the Federal Reserve in quite some detail, and I guarantee by the end of that, while you may have some questions, you will understand everything I've been trying to say today. Including the dispelling, which we've talked about on this show before, of some of the quotes revolved around the Federal Reserve, which included the quote by the signer of the bill that created the Federal Reserve, President was it Wilson, who, of course, someone took out of context and created a quote making it seem like he regretted his actions when, in fact, it was a lie all the time. So many quotes don't exist in reality. And, in fact, the quote was actually a campaign quote that happened way before he signed the Federal Reserve. So just absolute fallacy being thrown around that people quote and requote and reuse in their movies, from Alex Jones to the Money Masters to Freedom to Fascism and all of these movies. They don't verify the quotes. They don't verify the court cases that they quote. And unfortunately, that leads to many, many fallacies and lies. It's a shame that this beautiful thing, this internet, has been so poisoned by trolls and people who have just put such false information out there. But, I always say to people, if you want to know the truth, you're going to have to read for yourself. You're going to have to go to the primary resources. You're going to have to go to the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. You're going to have to go to the charters. You're going to have to go to all of the primary documents and discover for yourself. Discover for yourself, for instance, that as a stockholder in the Federal Reserve, 1, you are limited to a certain amount. 2, you are required by Congress, by the Federal Reserve Act, to be a stockholder. And 3, that those shares are not in any way ownership stock shares. They are simply membership shares, if you will, an investment into the Federal Reserve. That's all. Now, I can imagine Eustace Mullins going through books, a long time ago, and seeing that, oh, my God, J.P. Morgan owns stock in the Federal Reserve. Oh, my God, Bank of America, whoever these banks are the stockholders of the Federal Reserve. But, of course, when we compare that to the actual rules, the laws, which say they are required in order to print funny money, in order to be the people who create all of this toxic debt, they are required to be shareholders. Without being shareholders, the banks would not have the privilege of organized criminal activity along with the Federal Reserve, wholly supported by their stockholders in government. You see, we are so far past what we fear. We're so deep into this world governance, this corporatism, this internationalism, globalism. We're so far into it, and yet we're still afraid that we're going to enter into it. It's kind of an irony, really. So I see we have a couple callers on the line. Let's take Art. How you doing, Art?
Hey, brother man, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Oh, not too bad. I had wanted to get with you last night, but boy, were you on fire last night. So I was glad you kind of picked up where you left off last night tonight, because I wanted to kind of reflect on back to what you were saying last night, and that has to do with this issue of rights. And
yes.
For me, and this is even with a lot of the RBN hosts, when they talk about rights, even they, to a degree, really don't even know what they're talking about, because you just listen to what they say, and it's apparent that they are confused in many respects. So let's talk about rights. And if you'll bear with me, I think we can make a lot of sense here and maybe really get people's brains cooking here a little bit.
Let's cook them.
Fan the flames, if you will. I always love to take, when people start talking about rights, I ask them, do you even know where your rights come from and what they are? And they always want the Bill of Rights. And hold on, wait a minute. First of all, these are not amendments. Stop with this amendment garbage. Like you pointed out last night, these are articles. And if you look at this so-called Bill of Rights, there are 12 articles. And so when you talk about the First Amendment, wait a minute. Let's look at Article 1. It has nothing to do with free speech or freedom of the press. It's all about the number of representatives per number of people. Article 2 has nothing to do with right to keep and bear arms. Article 2 is about whether, the compensation for those in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. It's not till you get to Article 3 where you start getting into free speech and freedom of religion and things like this. It's not till you get to Article 4 where you get into militia and the right to keep and bear arms. But this is not where your rights come from. You want to know where your rights come from, you go back to the Declaration of Independence and you look at, I think it's the second half of the first sentence of the second paragraph, where it says, all men are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights by who? Their creator. So where do your rights come from? It comes from that which created you. You were born with them. Now, what is a right? And people will look at you and they're like,
Well, now, wait a minute. Now, you said something very important. So you got to ask the question now, who created you? Well, a lot of people, might say government. But really, what we're talking about is our creator. Whatever you believe is fine. The real question you got to ask is, who created your person? Who created your status? Who created your artificial corporation. Now you have an owner. Now you have someone that can define what your rights are, because you're admitting to and respecting what the Bible says not to do. Persons do not respect or hold on to or worship persons, which means corporations. That is what the rights apply to.
Right. Well, that's if you're working within the corporation, but this is where I try to get people to break away from that mindset and think about who created you. You were created by a divine essence which cannot be described, cannot be defined, and cannot be identified. Yes. It is completely beyond anything that our pitiful, pathetic minds can comprehend. There is where your natural inherent rights come from. So, what is a right? And this is where people get lost. And I say, well, if you want to know what a right is, you have to understand one very simple word: power. What is power? I am preferable to Black's Law, first edition. Power is sometimes used in the same sense as right when we speak of the powers of user and disposition which the owner of property has over it. But strictly speaking, a power is that which creates a special or exceptional right or enables a person to do something which he could not otherwise do. But I'll get to Black's 1856 here in a minute, because I know that's what you like. Or Bouvier's, I'm sorry. Because I know you like Bouvier.
Absolutely. All right, stay with us. Me and Art is going to break down rights, baby. Stay tuned. The great fallacy of bearing arms. Great fallacy of where that right actually comes from. Now, I want you to listen to a couple of quotes here before we get back to Art here. It's so important to understand this, that well, let me just read. Okay, this is again the United States versus Cruikshank, 1875 decision. It says very clearly, This, if you just figure out what these two quotes say, you'll understand what we're trying to say here. The right to bear arms is not granted by the Constitution, neither is it in any manner dependent upon that instrument for its existence. What does that mean? That means the right to bear arms existed way before the Constitution ever came around. What came first, arms or the Constitution? Well, that's a pretty easy one, since arms were around with swords and everything else. So the right to bear arms is not granted by the Constitution. What does it actually say? It says that as a negative, if you will, a negative averment, a negative demand, your negative right to bear arms cannot be infringed by Congress. It doesn't say that your right to bear arms comes from the Constitution. In fact, if you read the Second Amendment, it's quite clear, although it doesn't say it. It says that the right to bear arms already exists, and that it shall not be harmed in any way. It goes on to say the Second Amendment means no more than that it shall not be infringed by Congress, and has no other effect than to restrict the powers of the national government. And in reality, the reason that they state that is actually, it's very easy to understand. Just like the corporate charter, the Constitution is actually called the Charter for Freedom, just like the Constitution or charter for Walmart has nothing to do with me as a man or a person, unless I'm within their jurisdiction, unless I'm an employee, in other words. The Constitution of the United States, the charter that created the federal corporation, has nothing to do with the people or the states. It is strictly, as this says, no other effect than to restrict the powers of the national government. That is what the Constitution is. Now, when we go to one other thing here, which is Barron versus Baltimore in 1833, very clear. The first 10 amendments contain no expression indicating an intention to apply them to the state governments. In other words, the republics had nothing to do with the Constitution. The Constitution created the national federal government. It did not create the states. It does not do anything to the states. Unfortunately, what that means, because it does not apply to the states, well, guess what, folks? Where are the people? The people are in the states. If the first 10 amendments, according to the Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall, who wrote this unanimous opinion, if the first 10 amendments contain no expression indicating an intention to apply them to the state governments, the Constitution does not give you a right. It doesn't even apply to you. And that's what we try to continuously stress on this show, is that you cannot go up to, say, a state officer or a state police officer, or for that matter anyone, and claim a constitutional right. The constitutional right does not, in fact, exist with a person, with the people. It is strictly no different than the Walmart Constitution has anything to do with you out here, unless you're an employee of Walmart. You see, you have to understand the right to bear arms is a God-given right. And why would God want you to bear arms? Why, of course, to protect the rights that he bestowed on you, to protect your inherent rights. The Second Amendment, again, has nothing to do with your ability and right to bear arms. It only has to do with telling government, again, to piss off. You cannot take our guns. But, of course, we've fallen into the trap of registering our guns as property of government. Well, then, with that straw man, government can then regulate the property, or the title, if you will, the straw man that we call firearms. You see, that's why I say, do not register. Don't register your children. Don't register your home. Don't register your car. Don't register anything. I know that's, of course, more difficult than in theory than in practice. But I assure you, none of my arms are registered.
No, it's actually quite easy.
Go ahead, Art.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were ready for me. I was actually talking to somebody who's sitting right here next to me. Yeah, and we'll get to that registration thing here in just a minute, because I'm going to show you how easy that is too. But so anyway, we got power from blacks first. But I know you like Bouvier's 1856, which is the 6th edition, so let's look at power there. Now, power. This is either inherent or derivative. Remember, you were talking about two different definitions here. You have the positive and the negative. Well, here again, the same thing. Perfect illustration in Bouvier's 1856, edition 6. Power. This is either inherent or derivative. The former, inherent, is the right, ability, or faculty of doing something without receiving that right, ability, or faculty from another. The people have the power to establish a form of government, to change one already established. A father has legal power to chastise his son as a master does his apprentice. 2, the derivative power, which is usually known by the technical name of power, is an authority by which one person enables another to do an act for him, such as you get to drive because, well, the state gave you a driver's license, which means you get to drive, you don't get to travel. Powers of this kind were well known in the common law. Remember what you were talking about last night, the Bill of Rights coming from where? England? Under the Magna Carta? Yeah, let's go there for a little bit. Anyway, were known under common law and were divided into two sorts: naked powers or bare authorities, again, the positive and the negative, and powers coupled with an interest. There is a material difference between them. In the case of the former, if it be exceeded in the act done, it's entirely void. In the latter, it is good for so much as within the power, and void for the rest only. So again, you have the two, you have the positive and the negative. So if you want to really understand what a right is power. And how far does that extend? Well, all things have limits. And your power, or your right, has its limits only in as much as you can exercise that power or that right up until it interferes with another individual. The problem we have when we talk to people, Clint, is getting them to break free from the chains that bind the mind and get them to stop thinking as a corporate entity or a fiction in law or a straw man and think of themselves as a flesh and blood human spirit created by a divine essence. Beyond
which, ironically, is the only way you can have power.
Exactly.
The only way you can have power, and we like to say that authority and power are actually defined as permission. So because you're permissively giving your rights away, actually.
Right. Well,
we're talking about power.
When I studied law, and I studied under George Gordon, School of Common Law in Boise, Idaho, the one thing he taught us was that rights cannot be given to you. I don't care what Harry Reid said. Remember a couple of years back when Harry Reid said, when we in Congress create a right and give it to the people? Well, Harry, you're wrong, pal, because rights cannot be created, they cannot be given to you, and they cannot be taken away, and you can't even give them away. The best you can do is waive them. And how do you waive them? By sitting down, remaining silent, and refusing to stand up and exercise those rights.
Absolutely. We'll go even further with this when we get back, and we'll go back to Bouvier's and we'll read the definition for liberty, because again, we have to understand, just to give you a hint.
Hey neighbor, welcome again to this neighborhood. I'd like to show you something. You know what this is? Well, maybe if I press this button. Imagine every person that you see is somewhat different from every other person in the world. Some can do some things, some can do others. Did you ever think of the many things you've learned to do? Many things you learned. Did you ever grow anything in the garden of your mind? You can grow ideas in the garden of your mind. It's good to be curious about many things. You can think about things and make believe.
All right, folks, welcome back. So we need to define one more word today, just because it's one of those words that we throw around as usual, that we don't understand. Of course, through the Law Society. Has been shifted and squashed, and again, the remaining pulp has been turned into the definition of liberty. Well, there's a general definition of liberty, which is simply the freedom from restraint. Now, in this case, it's talking about the natural freedom, which means being free under God. Freedom from restraint, the power of acting as one thinks fit, without any restraint or control, except from the laws of nature. Now, when we say the laws of nature, sometime we'll have to read that full definition. That's very long. But you'll understand that it has nothing to do with man. The laws of nature simply to do no harm to others or their property, with a few other things added in, your 10 Commandments, etc. Jesus taught the natural law, how to live without man's rules and laws, how to live without the church rules and laws, how to live under God. Now, it goes right into it. It says liberty is divided into civil, natural, personal, and political. So we have 4 different versions of the word liberty. Now, civil obviously is the kind that government grants, and under the civil law of man. Natural is, again, the negative that we're talking about under God, and what we just described, freedom from restraint of man. In other words, the right to have nothing forced upon you. You have personal liberty, which is another political form of liberty, and you have strictly political liberty. Okay, political is, again, positive or positive law. That, just like freedom, it means you must obey the law to have that freedom from restraint. Government will restrain you if you break its laws. That is the limit of the liberty that is granted by the Constitution, granted by any of the laws of the states or the legislators, your attorneys, what we call representatives. Civil liberty, is the power to do whatever is permitted by the Constitution of the state and the laws of the land. Okay? That is not freedom from restraint. That is the freedom to obey the law. That's what civil liberty is. It is no other. Civil liberty is a little better than political liberty, but because it's defined as natural liberty, so far restrained by human laws and no further operating equally upon all the citizens as is necessary and expedient for the general advantage of the public. In other words, the civil liberty could be defined, if you will, as liberty under the natural law, where positive law enforced does nothing but enforce and support the natural law. So it's just a mere image of natural liberty, if you will. But let's talk about natural liberty. Here's how that's defined: is the right which nature gives to all mankind. Who gives it? Natural liberty is the right which nature gives to all mankind of disposing of their persons and property after the manner they judge most consonant to their happiness, on condition of their acting within the limits of the law of nature. Again, do no harm. Don't harm anybody. Don't tread on anybody else's property, and you'll be fine. And that they do not in any way abuse it to the prejudice of other men, which is actually what government does. So you can see that these words, again, have different meanings. Your guns, again, are a perfect example. In their natural state, they're just arms. But in their political state, they are firearms. They are controllable things. You have the right to have them as long as government gives you that liberty. You see? That liberty is based on the straw man, artificial name, status, whatever you want to call it, that firearms represents. That is the registration problem that we have in this country. Here, government, you can own everything I have, and you can then give me the power to use that, or the privilege, or the enjoyment of use. But you can take it from me at any time. Thank you so much. May I have another? All right, Art. You still on the line, buddy?
Yes, sir, I am.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, Art. Before you start in, because we have another caller, let's also bring Mike in Maryland on the line if we can, and we'll just have a little group chat. So please go ahead, Art.
Yes. Thanks for taking my call. I'm on the air now.
Okay. Yes, sir. But I was going to go to Art first, and then
okay.
We'll just have
let him
merry-go-round.
Let him go ahead.
Okay, Mike from Maryland. State your piece, my friend.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I have a two-part question for you, if I may. Yeah. Do you think that the current Federal Reserve System is a good thing? And if not, what would you suggest to replace it with?
Is the current Federal Reserve System a good thing? Well, I don't think that anything artificial is by inherent nature good or bad. I think that the idea of the Federal Reserve was actually a good idea because the banks were going crazy back then. Of course, there's so much more to this as far as the Emergency Banking Act and the takeover of like we talked about yesterday, the New Deal taking over of people basically as commodities. But the Federal Reserve Act in itself was a way to regulate the banks so that they weren't just creating Federal Reserve notes. Back then, of course, it was different, but the concept of it in itself is not bad. Now, what it has turned into and what it has been allowed to accomplish through all of this toxic debt is a bad thing. But if me or you were running the Federal Reserve, could we not ask the same question? I mean, would we not be like, okay, no more of this. Here's the Glass-Steagall Act. We're going to make the rules. The banks can't do anything except help people with no interest loans. We're going to abolish interest. We're going to write off all the interest on Federal Reserve notes no longer. I mean, if the right people were to be running the Federal Reserve, could we not ask the same question? And see, that's the problem with assigning a good or bad to something that doesn't even exist because it's only on a piece of paper.
So then I just want to get a straight answer. So you think the current system, do Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's been good for this country, or do you think it's a bad?
No. It's a horrible thing. It's an absolutely horrible thing. But what I was trying to get across earlier is that if you just suddenly lose or quote unquote end the Fed and you do not have a replacement for that system, do you know how many people would love to get their hands on the financial structure of America? Do you know that these people are planning to go to the international banking system, to the IMF and to the World Bank, and they want to end the Fed because that's the only way that you can lose the sovereignty of the dollar?
Well, then that begs the question, then what would you replace it with if we could make a smooth transition?
Well, see, now my personal opinion on that is that if you're going to have a federal or a national currency, that currency should only be for government. All of us out here in consumer land should be able to make our own currencies. The solution to the Federal Reserve and to a monopoly on money is simply competition. If you have 1,000 currencies all doing their own things, if one city has one currency and that's the only way to ensure that no currency can get a monopoly stranglehold on the world and take it over thusly, and then force other countries to use the dollar, to force other countries in OPEC to use the dollar as the reserve currency for oil, for instance. That is the solution. It's simply competition is the only solution to the dollar. So if we go to a world system because we feel like we want to end the one thing that actually does regulate, whether it regulates in a good or bad way, if we end the one thing that actually, the independent agencies of government that actually regulates the dollar and controls the banks, well, guess what? You've just entered into an international system then where there is no restraint. So do I have a replacement system? That's one of the big problems. No one has a replacement. There is no replacement. Yet you want to end it without a replacement. That's the big fallacy of ending the Fed.
So then, if I understand you correctly, then you think that we should have each state or each city should be able to just have their own currency? Is that what you're saying?
I don't think that currency should be regulated. In other words, if I want to create a currency with you, my friend Mike in Maryland, then we can have our own currency. We don't need anybody else's currency. I don't need the state's currency to operate. So
it is like a finger pointing away to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger or you will miss all that heavenly glory. Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless, like water. Water can flow.
You have the goldies, of course, and I suggest everybody go to catfor1.com and read Walter Burian's 50-year plan. Now, let's say that we change, just to give you an example of what I don't believe in. Let's just say that we went with the whole concept of backing the gold again by gold. Now, remembering, of course, that the gold price is fixed every day by what's called the London fixing. It's a commodity. It is a commodity used in many things. It's one of the most important, one of the most important minerals for health. It cures insomnia. If you were to go rake the ocean with a process I can't remember the name of, you have almost an unlimited supply of gold. Okay, it's in a macroscopic form all throughout the ocean. It's one of the minerals of the ocean water. If they could simply do that cheaply, extract the gold from the ocean water, and you can find a way. And of course, that was done for a while in Israel, but it was so expensive, the gold price wasn't good enough to do that. So you have an unlimited supply of gold. If you didn't have the monetary requirements to do so. So the scarcity thing of gold, in other words, is what I'm saying, especially now with ground penetrating radar, is an absolute fallacy. There is no scarcity other than what is created. Just like what's his name with the diamond industry, where he said that the only way to keep diamonds expensive is to pretend and make people think that there is a artificial scarcity. All right, so the concept that the dollar should, say, be backed by a precious metal or some other commodity, again, in my opinion, is completely, unless you've completely made it so that gold is controlled by you, or you base it on the gold that you already have and no other gold, yeah, I guess I could see it, although that's pretty much what we have already. Like I said, 230 million troy ounces of gold is currently collateralizing what we call the dollar. So when we're talking about currency, or we're talking about quote-unquote money, anything can be money. Seashells, marks and sticks, whatever. I don't think that should be a nationally controlled issue other than a national currency that is used for national things. As far as the people should be allowed to do exactly what they want to do, which is to create their own currency, to trade in silver or gold or whatever they want to trade in, whatever commodity they choose, chickens, eggs, whatever. Okay, money is, as we say, the root of all evil. Okay, money is not used for barter or exchange anymore. It's hoarded, and it's used for force. It's used to build nations. It's used to force other countries and other nations, other peoples into slavery. Okay, so money, the concept of money, I think it needs to be explored in much greater detail than just saying, oh, let's go to a gold-backed currency. No. Remember, the Rothschild banking industry is the one that sets the price of gold every day, along with six or seven other banks. Go look up the London gold fixing. So money there's no easy answer to money other than to say the only thing that can fix the power of money that is monopolized is to allow, without punishment or pain, people to create their own currencies, independent currencies of in other words, competition, so that no money can. If one money gets hoarded by one person, well, guess what? I mean, if we all said, hey, screw you, Rothschilds, we're not going to use the dollar anymore, well, then his trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars are suddenly worthless because no one is trading in them anymore. See, that's the danger of this national currency and forcing everybody to use it. So that's the best answer I can give you. It's something that not one man should be deciding. Do we still have our callers? Mike in Maryland?
Yeah, may I ask one more question?
Sure.
Well, okay, so then if I understand you correctly, you say you and I should be able to have our own individual currency. So you're talking about the potential of millions of currencies in this country if people agree to have their own. Well, how do you conduct international trade if they have all these currencies? And also, too, are you saying that our currency is backed completely by gold? Is that what you're saying as well?
No, not at all. I'm telling you that the 238, I think, if I'm getting that figure correct, the 238 million troy ounces of gold were pledged to the Federal Reserve in return for gold certificates, which are then traded at market value. And the price that was set for that gold was $42.29. That is what's sitting in Fort Knox and 3 other banks, or vaults, I should say, guarded by the military. Okay, that's the other, concept that there's no gold in Fort Knox. Well, that's a bunch of hooey.
Well, maybe I can help out a little bit here, Clint, because I actually live this life. And, gold, I think, would be something that, would be used between governments and countries for them to be able to pay their bills and work with each other on paying off whatever debts might be owed. But when you talk about currency being a personal issue, this is something that I actually live. And I'll give you an example. I go down the road here. It's a guy does bales of hay. So I go down the road when he's got his hay cut, it's all baled up. He does square bales. I spend one day tossing bales of hay for this guy to help get it loaded onto the trailer, hauled up to the barn, stored up in the barn. He sells this hay to anybody who needs hay for whatever reason. But in exchange for helping throw his bales and load them into the barn, I don't get paid money. What I end up with is I walk away with enough hay for nests, because I have to clean out my chicken coop regularly and change the hay in the nests. I get enough hay to nest my chickens for an entire year and hay to bed my rabbits when they're ready to deliver their babies. This is a currency for me. My labor gets me hay.
And this is, to me, this is a beautiful life. This is what I seek to have. So
I don't need money.
Right.
What do I need
and that's
money for?
But that's the thing. You are using a form of money. It's just not a currency. You're creating your own money. It doesn't have to be a paper currency. It doesn't have to be a piece of silver or a piece of metal. It could be anything you want. And that is the very basis, the very foundation of independence. And I'm not talking political independence. I'm talking natural or negative independence.
Yeah, and this is the problem that people run into. You know, you hear people complain about, man, they're taxing me out the wazoo. Yeah, but you're dealing in their currency.
Yes.
I don't pay taxes. I don't have to pay taxes because I understand what the word property means, and my labor is my property. So if I exchange my labor, which is my property, for something that I need, well, you can't tax that because the Supreme Court has already ruled that a man's property cannot be taxed, which goes right to what you were saying earlier about don't register your property. I live in a camper. I put it to the test. I took one of my students. We went to the courthouse in town. I walked in with a bill of sale. You know, they would not register my camper. I knew they wouldn't. But they told me that you can't register a camper with a bill of sale. You must have a title. So I'm standing there and I'm talking to the clerk herself right in front of all the people who work under her and all the customers at the desk there. And I said, so you're telling me that I can't register this? And she says, exactly. I said, well, that means you can't tax it. You can't take it away from me for failing to pay taxes, right? And she said, absolutely. I said, thank you, ma'am. Took my student out the door and left everybody sitting in there, jaws hit the floor. Because I brought it up about the manufacturer's statement of origin, who owns your car, who owns your property, who owns your house, because the mortgage office was there too. And I just floored everybody, and no one knew.
It's a wonderful feeling, too.
I owned it registered.
It's a wonderful feeling. I went in there and I said, look, I've got a farmer. He has a truck. Truck's been paid off for years, probably decades. And the truck is only for the farm except to go get gas. And, of course, there's rules and regulations where you can drive a vehicle, if you will, off of the premises or a certain amount of miles, like 40 miles. I said, how does he get a non-registered pass that says farm use only? She turns to the page in the DMV vehicle, and I was like, can I have a copy of that? What does it say? What does it say? It says no contribution required, free permit, basically.
Yeah.
All you need to do is go to a farm store, buy a plate or make your own that says farm use only. That's all you have to do. You don't need all of this stuff. That's why it's so important, I think, with what you're doing is, unfortunately, they made these rules that say you're either in the farm belt or you're not in the farm belt, and they decide instead of you, which is why it's so important to not have, again, real estate, to have property. And that's a whole other conversation. I want to thank you guys for calling. Sorry we didn't get to Fred in California. Any last words, gentlemen?
No, great show, Clint. Keep up the good work.
Sorry.